must be for the people and by the people, and its benefit should be shared among the people. We care about people's value, rights, and interests, and freedom, the quality of their life, their development potential, and happiness index. Because our goal is to realize the all-round development of the people.
Then, to prevent the twin nightmares, Jintao decided to create a new market in Africa to prevent the slowing economy.
Even in character, one.
These young Kenyans already speak English, a legacy of the British Empire in Africa. But now they have decided to learn
但是在哪个运动上
Chinese.
所以今后我们在组织各项
This is the Confucius Institute at Nairobi University. For these students, taking Chinese is, as they say, a no-brainer.
Chinese language is important because China is growing so much, and the influence of China now in Africa and most of the world is higher than it was last years.
What about Chinese athletes?
Africans want to benefit from China's economic boom. The Chinese are bullish on Africa. They want the raw materials to fuel their ravenous economy. 1/3 of what's exported from Africa to China is oil. But more and more goods are moving in the other direction, from China to Africa, arriving, as it were, right on the continent's doorstep. All the goods that come from China to East Africa arrive here at the port of Mombasa. In fact, the massive cranes unloading the container ships are also made in China. It is just the first clue of the China connection. The Mombasa to Nairobi road, the vital link from the east coast to the interior of Africa. It used to be the worst 350-mile stretch of road in the region. 8 years ago, a huge section was rebuilt by the Chinese. Ahmed Abdullah has just begun his 1,200-mile journey from Mombasa on the eastern edge of Africa to Congo.
Now it's good. Now it's very good.
And before?
Before it's bad.
So what sorts of things imported from China are those trucks carrying? Just about everything you can imagine, from pots and pans to the most sophisticated computers, all cheap. Go to the electronic shops and you'll find them. Shoes from China seem to be everywhere.
The cheapest, they are from China.
From China?
Yeah.
The cheapest ones?
Yeah.
There are loads and loads of them, overwhelming African shoemakers like this man. His name is Emmanuel, and he lives in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, where we traveled next. His tiny company, one employee, makes shoes, also belts and handbags. He says it's difficult for us to compete with Chinese products. They are sold at much lower prices than what we sell. They are cheap, $6 for a pair of the Chinese shoes, about $4 less than the Tanzanian shoes. In a country where people don't have much money, no contest. U.S. diplomat George Aldridge monitors Chinese commerce in East Africa.
This might be the great irony of our new century so far, that a ostensibly communist country has become the most ruthless capitalist country in the world, undercutting producers, not just American producers, but African producers.
This is a fairly typical market by African standards, and many of the products here, a growing number of the products here, are Chinese. But it's not just the products that are from China. Many of the people who own these shops are from China. The man in the shop next door, Fazil Natumani, blames the Chinese for undercutting everyone. If we could chase them away, he says, we would. It would be better if they weren't here. The big surprise in all this is that China doesn't see itself as a competitor or the so-called ruthless capitalist aggressor.
Since we are both belonging to the developing country and we have our similar experience and similar task for Chinese and African governments to develop their economy.
If you drive around the capital of Tanzania, it doesn't take long to find the Chinese at work. We were allowed onto one building site, and it helps understand how Chinese companies are consistently able to win contracts over Western companies. 8 Chinese construction workers, 50 Tanzanians.
As far as the Chinese go, they get no vacations to China, no holidays the entire time they're on this project, and it lasts 2 years. They still have 1 year to go.
Their only connection to home is the TV set. Meals they cook themselves. They work long hours, but there is a noticeably relaxed interaction between the Chinese and the Tanzanians. Some of the Chinese have worked in Tanzania before, and a bit like the young Kenyans learning Mandarin, they have learned Swahili. Not necessarily to make friends. It's clear they're here to do business, just like the Chinese sending the cheap shoes, building roads, and buying the oil.
To maintain social control, for an example, Chinese government made a decision to kick out Google.
If I were advising the Chinese government today, and I'm not, but if I were, and they asked me about what to do on Google, I would have told them to kick Google out. I've never said that to a crowd before. Let me tell you why. From the Chinese perspective, not from my perspective. I was upset that Google was kicked out. It's unfortunate. This is definitely a hit to open speech and to free expression and to the ability of all of these repressed peoples to have access. And I mean Tibet and Xinjiang and all these things we know. But if I was China, different story. Because, you know, Google has access to an enormous amount of information. They're following all of this data that all of these Chinese citizens are collecting, and we don't know what they're doing with it. The Chinese don't know what they're doing with it. Now, if you're China and you think that over time the U.S.-China relationship is maybe not going to be so great, and you're conservative by nature and you hedge a lot, you don't want to take big risks, what happens if at some point Google decides they want to sell that information to the U.S. government? More importantly, what happens if the U.S. government demands access to that information because they need to know what these Chinese are up to? Do you want to take that risk if you're the Chinese government? You do not. You want a Chinese firm that you have control over, an influence over, and know what they're up to and can stop them if there's a problem with access to your data. I actually think that that was an incredibly foresightful decision by the Chinese government from their direct statist perspective. Now, the problem is, with state capitalism, the perspective is statist. It's not global. It's not humanist. It's supporting the perpetuation of that regime. It comes out of authoritarian regimes that used to have centrally planned economies. They don't work as well anymore because their people have more information. It may be authoritarian, but they want more stuff. They know a lot about what's happening in the world, and if you're an authoritarian state and you want to stay in power, you know central planning isn't going to do it. So what do? Instead, you use the tools of capitalism for political ends.
The term globalization has many different meanings to many different people in many different countries. The overall aspect of globalization is the idea of economies, governments, and people being interconnected. There are various effects that come along with globalization. One of them is looking at it from an industrial perspective. We see all these U.S. factories all around the world, and we wonder, why are they actually there? Well, looking at it from an economic perspective, it makes sense to U.S. big corporations to outsource cheap labor. I mean, why pay minimum wage here that's $8 where we can pay people by pennies in China or any underdeveloped country and take advantage of the lack of government regulations on workers' rights and labor laws. Anti-globalization activists claim that sweatshops are a big problem within the world. The amount of hours that people work, they work all day, and only getting like 4 hours rest, working 6 days a week, getting paid very little money for the work that they do and the amount of labor that they put in. A good example of this is Walmart, where their price is outrageously cheap.
The goal here is to keep the prices down, keep the people buying, and keep the inventory moving. How do they keep the prices down? Well, they don't pay the store workers very much, and they skimp on health insurance every time they can. It's all about externalizing the costs. What that means is that the real costs of making stuff aren't captured in the price. In other words, we aren't paying for the stuff we buy. I was thinking about this the other day. I was walking to work and I wanted to listen to the news, so I popped into a Radio Shack to buy a radio. I found this cute little green radio for $4.99. I was standing there in line to buy this thing, and I was thinking, how could $4.99 possibly capture the cost of making this radio and getting it into my hands? The metal was probably mined in South Africa. The petroleum was probably drilled in Iraq. The plastics were probably produced in China. And maybe the whole thing was assembled by some 15-year-old in a maquiladora in Mexico. $4.99 wouldn't even pay the rent for the shelf space it occupied until I came along, let alone part of the staff guy's salary who helped me pick it out, or the multiple ocean cruises and truck rides pieces of this radio went on. That's how I realized I didn't pay for the radio. So who did pay? Well, these people paid with the loss of their natural resource space. These people paid with the loss of their clean air, with increasing asthma and cancer rates. Kids in the Congo paid with their future. 30% of the kids in the Congo now have dropped out of school to mine coltan, a metal we need for our cheap and disposable electronics. These people even paid by having to cover their own health insurance. All along this system, people pitched in so I could get this radio for $4.99. And none of these contributions are recorded in any accounts book. That's what I mean by the company owners externalize the true costs of production.
As KFC, we see McDonald's, we see all these corporations that are made big in the US all around the world. And we wonder what kind of effect does that have on culture? Language disappearing is one thing that happens. You see, as people get more and more modernized, you start to see more English all around the world. And another aspect of looking at it is from an environmental aspect. We see all these underdeveloped countries making a big change in being the bigger city, being better than the United States. Well, they're, just like the United States, we went through the Industrial Revolution. Countries like China are going through the exact same thing. It is also said, scholars call it the dirty phase, is essential for growth in an economy. So looking at this perspective, we can see that the environment is going to play a big role when more countries around the world are wanting to become more developed as the economy changes and as globalization changes. I wonder to myself, why is globalization good? It depends. It really comes down to, does being modern help China succeed in their economy? Does globalization bring more jobs to the country, and help them regardless? Because without those U.S. corporations even there, what happens? There might not be any jobs for those peasant workers that are working such low wages. They might be on the streets doing nothing. So we look at many perspectives